What is the relationship of rising prices and the Federal Reserve? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's Libertarian Angle. The show, as y'all know, brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined by Richard Ebeling, my co-host, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again for another round.
It's good to see you, as always, and to be with our viewers and listeners for a little bit of their time.
Yeah, good to have you join us. We wrapped up our Civil Liberties Conference last night. I gave the concluding talk. It'll be online soon. This has turned out to be one of the best conferences we've ever had. For those of you that helped us put this thing together, thank you very much. And I should remind you all that we're in our end of year fundraising drive. The most of the money that funds us for the coming year is done at this time. And if you can see fit to renew your support or become a new donor to Future Freedom Foundation, we'd be very appreciative. It's support like yours that enables us to put on these great conferences, to do Libertarian Angle, our monthly journal, Future of Freedom, our FFF Daily. And we just greatly appreciate your support. So Richard, my backdrop's a little bit different today, as you'll notice. That's because I'm in my native state where I was born and raised. I'm in San Antonio, which is 150 miles north of Laredo, my hometown. But I spent a lot of summers here because my dad was from San Antonio, and so my cousins lived here, and my brother lives here. So I came down to visit, and I think you've been to San Antonio before, and have you visited the Alamo? I can't remember.
I have, but I want your take. So is the Alamo a symbol of independence and liberty, or of American imperialism?
Oh, no. Independence and liberty. And now, yeah, I might have a different answer when I leave the state, but I know I'm smart enough to know that you don't do any negative attacks on the Alamo. But it is an interesting question, though, because Santa Ana stood for the principle of strong centralized government. I mean, that's what he was trying to establish. The people in Texas, which was a northern province of Mexico, we often forget that, it was part of Mexico, and they believed in decentralization. Like they wanted Mexico City, just leave us alone, we'll manage our own affairs. So the Alamo is this hallowed ground in Texas, but yet most Texans are like most Americans. They favor a strong central government out of Washington, that takes care of them with Social Security, Medicare and Medicaid and so forth. Massive military industrial complex, CIA, NSA. These are the things that Santa Ana believed in, and he was trying to establish that type of principle on the people living in Texas. So it is kind of ironic.
Well, I lived in Texas myself for a while, as you may recall. That's how we met. I was living in Dallas, and you were practicing law. And I remember when I arrived in the state, I had come from New York and still had New York license plates on my car. And I'm driving, I'm there in Dallas maybe a couple of days, and I'm at an intersection, waiting for the light to change, and there's a car in front of me in the intersection. And I look at his bumper sticker, and the bumper sticker says, "If you love New York, get out of town." and then, I actually had to get it. Since I was moving to Texas, you have to, change of residence. I had to get a new driver's license. And so I go to the Texas DMV, and as it turned out, I had to retake everything, not just the written test, but a new driving test. And of course, down there, the automobile inspectors who test your driving skills are the Texas Rangers. So I go out, and this Texas Ranger takes my application as we get into the car, and he says, "A Yankee. We're going to have some fun, boy." My heart sank real bad. And then there was a mall. I assume there still is a mall in Dallas. I forget big mall. I forget what the name of it is, but obviously since it's a tourist area, that they have all these like little tourist trap shops, souvenirs and stuff. And I go in there, and maybe you recall, there'd always be like these mock versions of a Republic of Texas passport. They're a separate country. You need to have a Texas passport, otherwise you're in big trouble.
Yeah, that's got to be North Star Mall.
And one other thing is that if you go to London in Great Britain, near, I think it is St. James Park, on one side of James Park is a series of buildings dating from the 19th century, obviously restored, kept in good condition. But on one of them is a plaque. And that plaque designates that building was the embassy headquarters of the Republic of Texas before it was annexed by the United States.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome. Well, I remember that during the savings and loan crisis in the 1980s, there was massive losses on Wall Street, and there was a lot of people moving down to Texas from New York. And so there were signs in stores all over Dallas that said, "We don't care how you did it in New York." Because you know how New Yorkers are, Richard.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Texas is a unique place. And I say that mostly complimentary. I enjoyed my time in Texas.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning, that there's that old saying, Six Flags over Texas, because Texas is flown under Six Flags. But what a lot of people don't know is that my hometown of Laredo, actually, Seven Flags, because when Texas declared its independence, Laredo declared its independence at the same time, around the same time. And it was the capital of the Republic of the Rio Grande. And Santa Anna was able to suppress that revolution, but wasn't able to suppress the revolution in the large area of Texas. And so after after Sam Houston defeated Santa Anna's forces and they cut a deal there, it was always with the understanding that the Nueces River was the new border, not the Rio Grande.
Right.
And that was the disputed area that President Polk used as the excuse to start the war with Mexico. He sent troops down into that disputed area, which of course caused Mexican troops to attack him. It was their land as far as they were concerned. And Polk said, "Oh, we've been attacked. We now have to defend ourselves." And it was all just a ruse to steal what was effectively the northern half of Mexico. California, yes. Arizona, New Mexico.
1/3 of Mexico was annexed by the United States.
Yeah, because they had offered to buy it. We want to buy, 1/3 or 40% of your country. And they said, "Well, our country's not for sale." "Oh, no problem. We'll just start a war with you and take it from you."
Well, there were people in Congress that when towards the end of that war wanted to annex all of Mexico.
Well, just think we wouldn't have an illegal immigrant problem anymore, Richard, at least not from Mexico. Everybody be Americans.
Just worry about the Guatemalans coming across the border.
Right, but that's so far away, nobody would care.
Exactly. And then we would permanently have Montezuma's revenge.
That's true. All right, let's get on to business.
What? Okay.
Okay, sorry. We got to go to work. All right, so the big news right now is inflation. I mean, everybody's talking about it. All the statists are talking about it. Prices, now when they were referring to inflation, they're talking about rising prices. That prices are rising across the board, and everybody knows this. I mean, if you don't notice that prices are rising across the board, you've been in a cocoon or a cave or something. But you go to the gas station. I mean, driving down here, I mean, filling up my vehicle, it used to cost about $40. Now it's over $60.
Yes.
And then groceries prices are rising. And of course, we said this, when they were saying that the stimulus money was free, and all the statists were saying this is free money, we were saying, no, it's not free. You're going to see debasement of the currency taking place. The Federal Reserve is going to effectively start printing the money to finance these stimulus payments, and you're going to see that reflected in across the board price rises. And I forget what the number is, like a 6% increase this month. Now, what I find interesting about, now let me first say the positive aspect of this, that I don't see the statists blaming this on evil, greedy profiteers, which is what we traditionally have seen. I also don't see them calling for wage and price controls. So this indicates that we've made some progress, at least in that area. But where we still have challenges here is that if you read what all these statists are saying about this phenomenon, they're blaming it on other things, like the supply lines or the chips and the computers and so forth. And they're very rarely touching on what really is going on here. It's the debasement of the currency. Because as far as I can tell, Richard, you always have distortions in the market, but that just means that prices might rise in particular sectors in response to supply and demand. But when you see prices rising across the board on just about everything, that's a pretty strong sign that the currency is being debased. And we know it's being debased. I mean, we know that the Federal Reserve is doing this, expanding the money supply, accommodating this massive debt. I mean, what is it, $28 trillion now, and growing now with this big infrastructure bill? I mean, that's what the Fed has been doing, well, since the Fed was established, decade after decade after decade, debasing the currency. And that's what's going on now. So let me have your take on this whole thing, Richard. You've done that fantastic book for FFF, Monetary Central Planning in the Fed and the state. And so let's have your take on it.
Well, your core point is the important one, and that is if the central bank, in our case the Federal Reserve System, does not increase the money supply, the supply of loanable funds through the banking system, which then spreads out as the form of loans and spending by one sector of the economy after another as it percolates through the entire economy, there can be no general rise in prices. Let us suppose that the total amount of money in the U.S. economy was, let's say, $100, just for the sake of the example. And if you've been allocating that $100, so much for your food, so much for your gasoline, your rent, or your mortgage payment, you're going out for dinner and enjoying enjoyable evening at a movie theater, et cetera, et cetera. So you apportion that $100 out in different directions, let's say on a weekly or monthly basis. And let's suppose that the prices of one or more goods rise in these categories of your expenditures. Now, if you don't want to cut back on your demands for those goods, and given that you're confined to that $100 in my simplified example, if you're going to spend more of those $100 in one direction and pay those higher prices for these specific goods, then that means you have to reduce your spending in some other direction. If I'm spending $75 here and $25 there, and I'm now going to spend $30 here, then I have to reduce my spending in the other direction by $5 and therefore spend only $70 in that way. Now, that means that my demands are maintained here, but my demands have to decrease where I'm reallocating funds away from my expenditures. Now, given that fact, there cannot be a general rise in prices as a whole. Maintaining your purchases in one direction means a decrease in your demand and spending in the others. And therefore, there cannot be an overall rise in the prices of goods and services. Now, if we're going to be technical, and I apologize to the viewers and listeners, but I'm an economist, so I have to, the economists always say, other things held given, right? Ceteris paribus. It is true that people can draw down their cash balances, that is the average amount of money they hold in their accounts, and have fewer cash balances at hand to spend more money now. But that would be sort of a one-time response, like drawing down your savings, your cash balance savings, if you will. But in the long run, that doesn't permit you to have the systematic continuing rise of prices in general, higher and higher and higher. That can only come from an increase in the supply of the medium of exchange. And in our case, that's our Federal Reserve System. And what has the Federal Reserve been doing? Well, obviously, as you were saying, for decades, for over the century since the Fed has been in existence. But in the more narrow context, over the last 10 or 12 years, by which I mean since the 2008, 2009 financial crisis. First, their monetary and credit expansion created that financial and banking crisis of 08, 09. Since that time, the Federal Reserve has created, injected into the banking system trillions of more dollars, and especially at an accelerating rate over the last 2 years because of the government's and its response to the COVID crisis in the face of the lockdowns and shutdowns. So that there has been created trillions upon trillions of dollars put into the banking system by the Federal Reserve. The banks have partly lent those funds out. I'm saying partly because I'm going to have a footnote in a moment, if you'll permit me, Jacob, to explain why it has taken so long for the rising price effects to start demonstrating themselves in the face of this rather large monetary expansion. But the Fed has been expanding the money supply by these trillions of dollars. And it was inevitable that eventually all of these dollars coming after goods, particularly in the face of the shutdowns and lockdowns, where production has fallen off and has been difficult to recover in any rapid way, prices were going to rise. Now, the caveat that I made is that I will admit that I long expected during this last decade to see significantly higher price inflation, given the amount of monetary expansion that the Federal Reserve has taken on. But what the Federal Reserve has done, fearful of its own creating of this much money in the system, introduced a new trick in its toolkit of policy instruments. And then an additional trick is they've created these trillions of dollars. And rather than just doing the usual procedure, just leaving the banks alone, and the banks use all this extra money to make huge amounts of various types of loans in all types of directions, they have paid banks not to lend the reserves that they themselves created through the monetary expansion. So approximately 60% of all the money that the Federal Reserve has created over the last decade or so has been sitting in the banks unlent. And the reason being, Jacob, is that let's suppose that the bank could make, let's say, 1.5% from making a loan to you or me, right, with these low interest rates now. Well, the Federal Reserve has been paying those banks 1.5 plus a little fraction above that to keep that money unlent and on account in their own vaults. And as a consequence, a lot of this money has been not lent out because the Fed has been paying them not to lend the money that they created. But even with this, the fact is that trillions of dollars have percolated out into the economy. Prices were not going to stay as low as they had been for so long in general, increasing on average and in general by the consumer price index 1.5%, 2% at an annualized rate. Eventually, they were going to start rising. This has been exacerbated and now pushed forward by the fact that the shutdowns and the lockdowns disrupted production, as they refer to the supply chains. So in the face of these output shortages and failures to increase as rapidly to the levels that they had before the crisis set in 2 years ago, and then with all of this extra money available in the banking system and in people's pockets to spend on goods and services that they intensely want, prices have started basically exploding.
So why did the Fed do that to the banks, though, or tell them not to lend it out, or offer them that money?
They like entice them not to.
Yeah, but why?
Because they were afraid of that if the banks started lending all of the money that they were creating, it would create a much higher rate of price inflation than it wants to target.
All right, so now that the banks have that money, is that still going on?
Yes, the Federal Reserve still pays this little increment of extra interest to banks that don't lend all of the loanable reserves that they have available as cash for lending purposes.
Okay, and could that suddenly contribute to the problem, the price increases if the Fed stops doing that? Given all that money sitting in the banks?
Yes, you see, because you see the difficulty that the Fed is in. And I'm not talking as a free market economist or as a libertarian who doesn't like central banking. I'm just thinking about if you're on the board of governors of the Federal Reserve, and you have your mindset as to what you think the bank is supposed to do as a policy guiding element, right? Their mindset. If you try to take the money out of the banking system, okay, you have to sell off government securities and mortgages that the Federal Reserve had been buying in huge amounts over the last 10 years back into the market to pull that money out. Now, if you pull all that money out, there's less money in the banking system, and interest rates will start rising. So that's going to crush the economic recovery and slow down the political goal of pushing unemployment down even lower. But if you don't do those things, that is, pull money out of the system, then you're stuck with the following thing. You have to, if interest rates start rising because of inflationary fears, because you get an inflation premium on the rate of interest, as people expect the value of the dollar to be falling in the future, you have to then raise that premium higher and higher to always be keeping it slightly above what the banks could earn from lending to you and me. Or you just have to give up the ghost and just say, you know, we're not even going to try to stop this, and the inflation will just go on and get worse. Now, if I could be permitted to put on my crystal ball thinking cap here, and with as a good Austrian economist realizing that the most difficult thing to predict is the unpredictability of the future, my best guess is that whether Jeremy Powell, is renewed as Fed chairman, because his term as Fed chair ends in February, or whether as a variety of, quote, progressive economists and others are pressuring the White House to not reappoint him, but put in another board member who's much more activist than he. Regardless of who is reappointed, I will be very surprised to see if the Fed puts any significant brakes on its own monetary expansion looking to 2022. Why? Because while they say the Fed is above policy, it's an independent institution, it dances to the political tune like every other branch or division of government. And what's 2022? An election year. And while people are groaning about inflation, the fact is, if the Fed were to put the brakes on and unemployment starts rising again, production starts slowing down or even becoming stagnant again, that is not going to bode well for the Democrats to try to stay in control of the House and have their like narrow controlling situation in the Senate. And as a consequence of this, the Fed will be pressured not to put the brakes on in any noticeable way, given their own policy mindset, until after the 2022 election, in my humble opinion. I could be totally wrong, but I'll be very surprised if the Fed doesn't dance to the political tune of those who are in control of Congress and the White House.
No, I totally agree with you. I mean, that's the way they always operate. Whoever's in control, they defer to them. This will be especially true if Biden appoints his person as chairman of the Fed. They're gonna dance to his tune. They're gonna try to get the Democrats to continue control over Congress and so forth. So yeah, that's nothing new. But you know, from the long-term perspective, Richard, I mean, we've been talking about this for 32 years at FFF, is that it's not really a question of who the Fed chairman should be or what the rate of increase of the money supply should be or what interest rate should be, is that, and it's really a problem of, as like you put it in your book, monetary central planning in the state. It's a matter that the federal government is in charge of money and monetary affairs, which is essentially a socialist system. Monetary central planning. Central planning is a core feature of socialism. So you have all of the disadvantages that come with central planning taking place here. The chaos, what Ludwig von Mises called planned chaos. I mean, what better term to describe what's been happening with people's money? I think it's worth reminding ourselves that this is not what the nation started out with. That our founding principle, which is one of the good founding principles of America, was that there was sound money. It was gold and silver coins was the official money established by the Constitution. Now, the federal government was permitted to borrow, but everybody knew that those notes and bills were not money because the federal government wasn't given any power to print money. The only power they had was to coin money, and coin money means making coins. And so even though the notes or the bills may have circulated as the equivalent of money, everybody knew they were promises to pay money, and the money was gold and silver coins. And that was our official money. I mean, it was one of the biggest factors in the rise of the standard of living of the American people throughout the 19th century, and especially in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It was in 1913 that everything shifts to this monetary central planning model. And that was the beginning of the end. You've got moving into the 1930s with the Great Depression. We now know that the stock market crash was not the failure of free enterprise as we were taught in school. It was the failure of the Federal Reserve. They had manipulated the money supply, and it came back to haunt them with that stock market crash. They were really responsible for all the suicides on Wall Street, the people jumping out of the buildings, the mass unemployment, the destitution that took place through the Great Depression. That's the Federal Reserve. A lot of people still don't even realize that. In fact, one of the great things about Ben Bernanke when he was chairman was that he acknowledged that Milton Friedman was right about the Great Depression, the stock market crash being caused by the Fed. Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s nationalizes what had been the official money, gold and silver coins. It's one of the most repugnant acts in U.S. history. No constitutional amendment. He just changes the monetary system. Says, well, yeah, this was the founding system, but no more. We're now going to have paper money. And he makes it a felony offense. Imagine a felony to own what had been the official constitutional money for more than 150 years. And that was the beginning of the end. I mean, year after year, for a while, silver coins were still circulating. It was legal to continue owning silver, unlike gold coins. But after a point, like I think it was around the 1960s, they had flooded the money supply so much with debased currency that it didn't pay to use your silver coins. It paid to hoard them, hide them, and keep them because they were getting more valuable in terms of the paper money and the alloyed coins. And so they essentially have destroyed the monetary system of the United States with this system. And I think it's important that people recognize that, because at least we know that there's a way out of this, and that's to restore this sound founding principle. Now, I wouldn't say that the government necessarily has to be minting the coins. You can have a free market monetary system. That really is the ideal. This was Friedrich Hayek's concept of the denationalization of money. What do you think, Richard?
Well, I think that the ultimate goal from a free market, individualist, classical liberal perspective, a consistent one, would be the separating of money and the state. See, the reason why in the 19th century, so many of the leading economists of that era, whether it be, I'm thinking of British economists now, whether it be David Ricardo or Thomas Malthus or John Stuart Mill, or in France, economists like Frédéric Bastiat and Jean-Baptiste Say, and a variety of American economists of the 19th century, whose names would be even less familiar to, I think, many of the viewers and listeners. They all said that one cannot trust the government to have either direct or indirect control or even significant influence over the monetary system and the banking system, because governments will always, when they get into, quote, crises, will have a motive and incentive and an irresistible urge to gain control of the monetary printing press and use it to create the medium of exchange to cover its expenses, whether it be domestic expenses or particularly for its foreign wars, which was the pattern back then. They therefore argued that you had to have an external money outside of government control, and it should be a money that the market itself had evolved and developed and had, by custom and tradition, come to accept and have confidence in. And therefore, that was the idea that history had shown that the market had generated and had confidence in and was outside of the control of government when you have gold and silver. So that the ideal was, particularly after the wars with Napoleon, that is after Napoleon's defeat in 1815, first Great Britain and then France and then other countries formally went back to or established gold standards. So that by the end of the 19th century, these were government managed, that is, the government had its own central bank, so it was a government managed gold standard. But it's sort of like the person who who knows that he's a drunk, and he knows he needs a sponsor that takes him to the AA meetings whenever he feels like he's going to fall off the wagon. If you understand what I'm trying to make a parallel here. So it's like the external guy who's going to say, don't have that drink. Pour that bottle out. You're going to earn that next coin and that type of thing, right? So the gold standard was sort of that you can't increase the money supply. The reason being is that gold is the money. And if you issue the paper notes are supposed to represent quantities of gold. And if you produce a lot of paper notes, people are going to demand gold at their rate of exchange, so many of the units of the paper currency for an ounce of gold. And you're going to be threatening to see the banks hemorrhage gold, all the gold flooding out of your country, a monetary crisis, a destruction of the currency, all because of your inability to keep your expenditures within the confines of the tax money that you can persuade the voters and the citizens to accept and consider useful and necessary. Now, that external check worked beautifully until the First World War, as you were saying. Because even when the Federal Reserve was established in 1913, it was a gold-backed monetary system. America's central bank, like the Bank of England, the Bank of France, the Deutsche Bank, the Bank of Reich Bank, the Central Bank of Germany, etc., all were saying, you cannot issue more notes than you have gold in the vaults. But the First World War destroyed all of that, because then one belligerent country after another, regardless of what side they were on in the First World War, in short order of their participation in the war beginning, formally went off the gold standard, prohibited their citizens from turning in that nation's banknotes for gold at the fixed rate of exchange, and basically gave the people nothing but an official or a de facto paper currency to use, which they then printed and created these inflations throughout the war years. Of course, the dramatic ones being Germany, and then in the post-war period in Germany, a hyperinflation, became a caricature of that. But then the Great Depression came. There were these half-serious attempts to go back to a type of gold standard in the 1920s. But with the coming of the Great Depression, governments were not willing to stand fast because of practical politics and a change in ideology, to stand fast and leave the markets alone to freely correct in the face of their own monetary abuses. And as a consequence of this, they then started running budget deficits. They needed money to cover it. They didn't want to raise taxes in the climate of the Great Depression, or not as much as their greater expenditures would have required. And they, one after another, first Great Britain in 1931, then the United States in 1933, in short order, other European countries in 1934 and 35, all formally went off the gold standard. And since then, we have been basically both de jure and, if nothing else, de facto on paper money standards ever since. Government destroyed the sound monetary system that the far more classical liberal 19th century had helped establish, all but with central bank control, but no less an external check that prevented governments to abuse the handle of the monetary printing press.
Yeah, and you still see some semblance of it, with your Federal Reserve note in your pocketbook. I mean, it's a note. A note means a promise to pay, but what is the promise to pay? Promise to pay nothing except another Federal Reserve note.
Well, like I like to tell my students, Jacob, is that, because I'd use that very example, but there's the word note is on your $1 bill. So let's suppose you go to the bank and say, I want what this dollar represents. And you turn in the $1 bill and they give you 4 quarters. I said, no, I don't want 4. I want what the dollar represents. And they give you 10 dimes. I don't want that. I want what the dollar represents. And you turn back the 10 dimes and they give you 100 pennies. And no, and you hand in the 100 pennies, they give you back your dollar note.
Yeah, and
so it's just what the government has issued, and people continue to accept, and that's it.
That's right. But the situation is getting much worse. I mean, like you say, as Austrian economists, we can't predict when something's going to happen. We can just tell you it's going to happen. And when you're spending more than what you're bringing in by huge amounts, and you're financing that debt by just printing the money, this cannot end well. And it's just a matter of when it's going to end and how bad it's going to be.
See, and if I can just add something else that you had said earlier, that the voices are not heard right now, calling for price controls in the face of inflation, the same way we saw it in the 1970s, where a Republican president, Richard Milhous Nixon, imposed wage and price controls, which were kept in place by Gerald Ford and then into the Carter administration. But I will not be surprised if the inflation continues and they see no way to get off the crashing car. They will then say, you see, it's those greedy businessmen and this and that. No, it's evil. The 1%ers who control and manipulate everything, and they'll reintroduce price controls. Now, inflation with price controls is what the German free market economist Wilhelm Röpke called repressed inflation. He said it's even worse than open inflation, because at least with open inflation, even though prices are rising dramatically, the market is attempting to set the prices that, even under the inflation, sort of have some semblance of supply and demand relationships. But if the government imposes wage and price controls, then the prices are kept below where even the inflationary market would be setting them, and everything is thrown out of whack. Imbalances, distortions between every conceivable supply and demand throughout the economy, whether it be the consumer good market or the resource market. And then we're facing economic chaos.
Yeah, well, my favorite, you mentioned Gerald Ford, and my favorite part of the 1970s inflationary period was the buttons that Ford put out, "Whip inflation now, win," where he says, we've all got to rally together to fight inflation, like inflation was this external enemy that had invaded the United States, or like a COVID,
Yes.
whatever, and I mean, but no mention of the Federal Reserve at all. It was this external enemy that we have to combat. Whip inflation now.
Yeah. And then, if you recall, then there was Jimmy Carter, who in the face of the oil crisis, got on television, and he's in the White House in this rocking chair, and he said to the people of America, "I feel your pain." I wanted him to feel my pain. We must control our energy uses. So I said, great. I turned off the TV, so I didn't listen to the rest of his talk.
All right. On that excellent note, we'll wrap up. I greatly enjoyed the conversation, and thank you all for tuning in. Thanks for your support of FFF, and we will see you next week, Richard, and I'll see you next week.
Until next time, you take care.